You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this podcast in our new series, Let's Talk Sustainable Business. This is brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. And today, I will be talking to Dr. Márcia Balisciano from RELX about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Before we do that, I would like to mention that we record this podcast in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Our heart goes to all out there who are suffering. We believe achieving the ambitious targets of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals will not prevent pandemics, but make outbreaks less likely and will help minimize severe consequences. More about this during the podcast. So first, let me introduce our guest to you. Márcia is the global head of corporate responsibility at RELX, previously in parts known as Reed Elsevier. And today, this company is much more of a publishing house. It's a provider of global information-based analytics. Márcia, besides her role in RELX, is the chair of the UN Global Compact in the UK and a board member of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizen. Márcia is also the founding director of the Benjamin Franklin House in London. For this huge accomplishment, she received in 2007 the MBE. Before we dive into specific sustainability matters, Márcia, please tell us about yourself, how sustainability became an important part of your personal life, and a little bit about the Benjamin Franklin House in London. Over to you, Márcia.
Well, thank you, Uwe. It is great to participate. Thank you very much for inviting me. I guess it starts my interest in sustainability and the responsibility of all people to society from my mother. I was raised by an amazing single mother who instilled those values from a very early age. And I have had the good fortune of being the founding head of corporate responsibility at RELX. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about our journey within the company. And it's been a very interesting vantage point that I have had to see our transition over the last really 15 years plus from being, as you said, a traditional print-based publisher when I joined the business to really being a digital company today. But we all have other talents as well and other interests. And I have a great love for history. And I have been very lucky to be the founding director of Benjamin Franklin House in London. It's the only house still standing where Benjamin Franklin lived and worked. And in 2006, on Franklin's 300th birthday, the very day in January of that year, we opened to the public as a dynamic museum and an educational facility. As you mentioned, we're recording this while so many of us around the world are in a lockdown situation. And at Benjamin Franklin House, we, for the first time in our history, we have closed, but we have been focusing on what we can deliver via digital to a wider public and giving lectures and talks and educational activities online, which I'm sure would have interested Benjamin Franklin, who said he was born a couple hundred years too soon from his birth in 1706 because of his great passion for technology and innovation. He wanted to see what would become of that. So we're definitely reaping the rewards today of being able to communicate remotely and even record a podcast like today.
Yeah, having had the privilege of a tour to the Benjamin Franklin House, where you actually get historic scenes being enacted, that was really spectacular. And if any of our listeners are in London, hopefully when the lockdown is over, you should consider spending an hour there. It's only 50 or so yards away from Trafalgar Square. And as it might be very tempting for you and also for me to talk about this real pearl of conservation, we should now focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think we should call them for brevity now the UN SDGs, as they're known in the trade. Over the last few years, the UN SDGs have gained more prominence, which is no doubt good. But nevertheless, I think it would be worth our while to talk a little bit about what they are, how they came about. And Márcia, should we start actually with the Millennium Goals?
That's a good idea. And maybe just before we change gears, to say that any listeners who want to take a virtual tour of Benjamin Franklin House can just visit our website to get that. And the Benjamin Franklin House website. But indeed, the predecessor or the precursor to the SDGs were the MDGs. And coinciding with the year 2000 and the dawn of a new millennium, um, under the leadership of Kofi Annan, sadly passed away in 2019, who was the seventh UN Secretary General. 189 countries came together to mark the new millennium and to introduce these goals. The idea was that all the nations of the world and the different stakeholders needed to support aiding the world's poorest people over a 15-year period. And there were 8 goals, things like eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality and empowering women, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV, AIDS, and malaria, ensuring environmental sustainability, and global partnership for development. So these were 8 incredibly important goals, and they did achieve a lot. The number of people living in extreme poverty declined by more than half, according to the UN's MDG report, which was released at the end of the period in 2015. And things like number of out-of-school children of primary school age worldwide fell by almost half to an estimated 57 million in 2015, which was down from 100 million in 2000. There are a number of other important statistics, but despite these successes, as the MDGs drew to a close, there was a recognition, I think, that there was still so much yet to be done. And the progress across regions and countries was rather uneven. And you still had persistent gender equality, rise in global emissions of carbon dioxide, which had increased by over 50% between 1990 and 2015. Challenges of conflict being one of the biggest threats to human development. So, there were just a lot of issues that the world and the world's poorest people were facing that still needed to be addressed. So there was work being done by the different nation states to think about a follow-on from the MDGs. And so in September 2015, the SDGs were unanimously adopted by the 193 states of the UN under the leadership of the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. I think the thing for me that's important about the SDGs were the MDGs were for them, these world's poorest countries, countries that were working on development issues. The SDGs are for all countries. It's for the global north as well as the global south. And there's a recognition in expanding them from their initial mix to a wider set of issues that the 17 SDGs look at, but a recognition as well of the interconnectivity between these goals. So there are 17 of them.
Yeah, Márcia, I'm very glad that you talked about what was actually achieved with the Millennium Goals, because a lot of people, when the UN SDGs came about, were arguing, we had the Millennium Goals and not a lot was achieved. So why we were having now another set, an even more ambitious and wider scoped net. And I think what you just pointed out was very clear. The Millennium Goals achieved a lot of things, but they were very much focused around the poor countries. And the picture that people paint of the UN as a toothless tiger is actually not correct. And I think the interesting aspect of the UN SDGs was also the process by which they were agreed upon. Can you just say a couple of words about that? Because I think not everybody is aware that this was a very wide consultation.
Yes, I think that the different countries that comprise the UN, the 193 states, there was a lot of engagement about what these follow-on goals should be, and a lot of work across the different UN agencies within various member states, as well as the number of different international institutions that all had say in how they should be formulated and what they should include. And there are 169 targets which sit behind the 17 goals. They are very specific. They have each target has between 1 and 3 indicators that are used to measure progress toward reaching the targets. And we've done a little bit of work at RELX in our most recent corporate responsibility report of looking at which of these targets are business indicators, because a number of these issues are really the responsibility of nation states. But we know that all actors have a role to play, and business has a strong role within that, because they have the ability to have influence across a range of stakeholders between their employees, their investors, their customers, and the communities in which they operate. They need to be brought into the picture. So the UN Global Compact has done some work on this, and we have tried to indicate our disclosures relative to the SDG targets. So really kind of dig in and see what are these targets that relate to business, and uh, you know it provides a really great framework for looking at what you are currently doing and what you could be doing to advance these targets.
That's that's exactly, I think, one of the reasons why they have now gotten so wide attention, because they have been developed in a very concise process, and all the nations have signed up for it. And I think it's very important that you mention that it's not just the nation's responsibility, and business has to look at them and decide how to deal with it. We'll talk about that in the next podcast in more depth, I think. But what would you say? Some people say 17. Isn't that way too much? And all these targets underneath.
Well, it is a fair point. Even those of us that are quite engaged with the terminology of the SDGs might struggle when I just pull out, SDG 15. Can you say quickly that that is life on land? Or, if it's number 9, do you know immediately that that's industry, innovation, and infrastructure? For me, I think it's less important that we are aware of the all of the detail, but to understand it's a kind of interlocking agenda, and that it's okay to use it as a framework for assessing what you are doing against these goals. So it may not roll off the tongue and have 5 of them that are easy to recite, but I think this level of complexity was needed to make sure that it's touching all aspects of people and planet and prosperity. So these three kind of areas, and they all sort of marry up into one of those pillars. And different people divide it up into different ways. But I think um, you need to have this kind of holistic look at the issues that we face here on Earth, in terms of the the need to ensure that we are looking across the piece for the impact. You can't have children who are having a quality education, SDG 4, if they don't have food and they're hungry, SDG 2. And to get all of these done, you need SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals. So there's a kind of they really are working together. But it is a fair point. But even if you don't know, there's a kind of ethos. Even if you can't name these, and you might use other words, the essence will needs to remain the same. That we need to be ensuring that we are considering, what is happening in our cities, SDG 11, what is happening in our oceans, SDG 14. That we all are focused on climate, the biggest challenge that we face globally, the COVID-19 virus, horrific crisis notwithstanding. So they are interlocking, and I'm sure we're going to talk in our next podcast about, can every company be good at every one of these? No, they probably can't be, but at least there's a framework that is looking at this from a very full perspective about the challenges that society faces.
I couldn't agree more, Marcia. For me, it feels like we have finally found a common language what actually sustainability means. It's defining the scope of what people have to be looking at and the interconnectivity of all these different aspects. So I think part of the success that so many people are relating to the UN SDGs now is that it's a common framework which is globally agreed in a common language. So I think you're absolutely right. And we will talk about how to approach that from a corporate perspective. But before we do that, uh, I made a very bold statement at the beginning about that the UN SDGs could help uh, once they have been achieved combating pandemics. And I thought you and I should just look at two of the goals and talk a little bit about this, why this could be the case. And let me suggest the one that you just mentioned, Sustainable Development Goal 15, Life on Land. It says, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and hold biodiversity loss. And it has many targets, but I'll just cite two, and then let's see how you feel about how that relates to COVID-19. It says, take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, hold the loss of biodiversity, and by 2020 protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species. And 15.7 is, take urgent actions to end poaching and trafficking of protected species of flora and fauna, address both demand and supply of illegal wildlife products. I think that resonates, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. And I'm not an expert in those areas, but just looking at the loss of biodiversity, the loss of habitat, and some reading that I have done since the outbreak of the crisis, that we don't know the source of the virus, but it's likely it was a zoonotic transmission from animal to human. And if you take the case of bats, they have in the past very robust immune systems, better places to be able to breed and to do what bats do. And when you take that land away, you're also stressing their immune system. You make it more difficult for them to fight infection, perhaps that they could have easily handled before. And then also, when you are coming into close contact with animals, and where there is a risk of this kind of transmission, the fact that on the one side it is truly amazing how interconnected we all are, that you could be in a very rural place or in a jungle one day and be in a major metropolis the next, means that it isn't like it was in the past where maybe if there was that type of an infection, that it would be slowed in its spread or it would be more naturally contained. Here we are all so highly interconnected and traveling from one location to the next, and in some ways, minus the carbon emissions from travel, that can be an amazing thing, but it also means that it is more likely to cause an uptick in the spread of a virus, as we have seen. So I think one of the best things that we could do in order to make sure that this kind of event doesn't happen in the future is indeed protecting our species. I just have a kind of human impulse, again, not being a specialist, that the animals of our world, they are innocent, and they have to deal with the challenges that men and women on Earth have, um, you know, put on them
Mm.
through our human activity. So I think increasing biodiversity, ensuring that we are reversing deforestation. It's one of the best things that we can do for so many things, not only for flora and fauna, but also for combating climate change. So I think there
Yeah.
is a real connection there.
No, I agree, and I find it sometimes interesting. When you talk about biodiversity, and some people say, what has that to do with me? And when we have some projects, and then environmentalists and people say, but you shouldn't do this because you destroy a biodiverse habitat, and then people say, what's more, are suddenly animals more important than human beings? And we now actually see that we all live together, and we have to be in a reasonable balance. Otherwise, we face very severe problems as we currently do. And that brings me to goal number 3: good health and well being, ensure healthy lives, and promote well being for all at all ages. At all ages. And target 3.8 is achieve universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential health care services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. Sounds also quite relevant, doesn't it?
Yes, incredibly relevant. And looking at how this virus has put the spotlight on the essential nature of health. I guess we all intuitively know that, and in the pursuit of other things in life, without health, you don't have anything. But just the sheer impact across the various nations, and the concern that the World Health Organization has, and any thinking person imagining the challenge that we in the Northern Hemisphere, or in the uh, more developed countries have faced relative to the virus. The challenge for the less developed countries is truly frightening and staggering. So uh, I think that having a focus on sharing of information, particularly related to research and science is incredibly important. And of course, we at RELX have Elsevier, which is one of the world's largest scientific information providers. So it's incredibly important to us to be fostering an environment which is not only supporting uh, research from the most developed countries, but from those that are on the front line of so many of the issues uh, that are embodied by the SDGs. And in fact, one of our goals at RELX this year is to produce an SDG graphic, as we call it, for every SDG. So here, what we're looking at is the state of knowledge underpinning the SDGs, which countries are producing content, how good is that content in terms of a few different measures, how often is it cited or what share of the output of research for that country. And most importantly to me, I think, is the collaboration between North and South. We
Mm.
did one last year of these SDG graphics, for example, well, we did two, one on SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, one on SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. Only 1% of the output came from the least developed countries. That's simply not good enough. And
Mm.
so on our side, with our analytical tools, we can identify the problem, but then we also need to be part of the solution. So, among the things that we're trying to do, we have a program called Research Without Borders with a number of partners where we're taking our experts and bringing them, when they aren't in lockdown, to places in Africa, for example, to support the output of Indigenous research, helping them about the
Yeah.
sustainability of their own journals, teaching things about open access and things that can be helpful in terms of ensuring that output in, for example, Africa is increasing.
Yeah, you already. I think this is really very encouraging, and I've seen some of the things you've been doing, and that leads us to the discussion around what actually the business context of the UN SDGs is. You've already mentioned that, of course, the SDGs were developed and described in the sense of nations making a commitment towards the SDGs, and therefore it doesn't lend itself automatically to targets from companies, but there are very clear links, and we will explore that in next week's podcast together with you and see how RELX is actually doing this in more detail than what you've just mentioned. And I think it is important for the audience to realize that every nation in the UN has committed to these SDGs, and each of your countries you live in has certain targets, and it might be actually worth your while to understand what these targets are, and they could have a lot of relevance for where you're doing business. So I, at this point in time, Marcia, I would like to thank you for a very engaging conversation, um, and um, and as I said, we will continue this in next week's podcast, where we want to talk about the relevance of these SDGs for 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 business. Would you like to summarize what we've just discussed? What are the most important points for our listeners you would like to convey?
Well, I think it's to take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals and take a look at what they entail, what they're asking of business in terms of the breadth of engagement, and there is an opportunity to just look back into your organizations to see what you're currently doing and where you might be able to increase effort, and the fact that while these may be designed for states, there's a very important contribution that the convening power of business, both from an economic point of view and from the ability to mobilize stakeholders, and the innovation side of business, really has a role to play.
Thank you so much, Márcia. And if you listeners have enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.